In the run-up to Valentine's Day of 2015, I found myself with a rather unfamiliar feeling: loneliness. From 2010 onwards, I'd been so focused on med school that I was content to barely have a social life, and content to have a non-existent romantic life. I told myself that it could all wait until I was done with school, and that frankly it would be irresponsible for me to curate distractions for myself while I was trying to reach the first milestone in my career goals. But after most of my high school friends had graduated and my social media feed began to swell with pictures of their dates, weddings, and pregnancy pictures, I began to feel like that I was really missing out. Call it social pressure or just plain loneliness, but I began to tell myself that it wouldn't be terrible if I just did a little casual dating, especially around the most romantic time of the year. So I did what most younger folks my age do, and I downloaded one or two of the more popular dating apps. Being a woman and all, I didn't have any trouble getting matches. The trouble was actually finding a guy I liked after the opening conversation. So many of them seemed either too into it or clingy or way too cool and uninterested. The last thing I wanted was someone who'd badger me during intense periods of study, but I also didn't want to just be some player's option either. I know that sounds like I was asking for the impossible, and trust me, for a while, I thought I was being way too picky. But then came a guy that we'll call Ryan, and I only give him a fake name to protect the innocent. Ryan seemed charming, intelligent, and respectful, but he also took a while to answer my messages. I know that last part seems like a weird thing to count as a virtue, but I wanted a guy who had his own stuff going on. I liked the idea that he was sometimes just too busy to talk, and I guess that's because I saw a little of myself in him, but I digress. Out of all the guys I spoke to, Ryan was 100% the leading candidate. So there came a point where I straight up asked him if he had any Valentine's Day plans. I'm quick to add that I didn't ask him out. I just asked if he had plans, then waited for him to take the hint. Thankfully, he did, and he told me he knew of this cute little Portuguese bistro-type place that did some of the best seafood he'd ever had. Now, he didn't know this. I have the most boring Anglophone surname ever, but I'm actually a quarter Portuguese, so I basically jumped on the offer and got super excited for the date. Valentine's Day fell on a Saturday that year, and I remember that because we ended up having to stew on a waiting list before our reservation was confirmed. Obviously, the will we won't we drama had me even more excited than before, and when the time came to actually go meet him, I was feeling very romantic indeed. He looked amazing too. Three-piece suit, perfect hair, plus a little tactical stubble that accentuated his masculinity. Then when he took off his jacket, hung it over the back of his chair, then rolled the sleeves of his white shirt up. My God. I thought I was going to explode with desire right then and there. We talked, picked out some appetizers, and for about 45 minutes the date was going incredibly well. But then I saw two people walk into the bistro that looked very, very out of place. Ryan had his back to the door, so he didn't see them walk in, but I did. And right away their state trooper uniform stuck out like a sore thumb. I'm sure you know the kind I'm talking about. The Smokey Bear hat with the super shiny tie clip thing, but as much as they initially grabbed my attention, I didn't want to be rude and interrupt Ryan in the middle of an anecdote. He definitely noticed me looking over his shoulder, but they were nothing but momentary glances, so not nearly enough for him to stop talking and looking around. Out of my peripheral vision, I see the cops being greeted by the restaurant's maitre d'. Then, I see the maitre d' pointing in our general direction, but again, nothing to be too concerned about. But then, the two cops started walking past a row of tables in our direction, and this is when I have to break eye contact and look up at them, because they stop right next to our table. Again, I've changed some of the details to protect the innocent. "Sir?" one of them said. Ryan looked up before the cop continued. "Are you Ryan Smith of 111 Residential Street?" Ryan responded in the affirmative, then asked if there was a problem. My heart and mind are both racing by this point, and in those few split seconds, I figured something terrible had happened to someone Ryan knew. That, or there had been like a break-in his home or something. I never, ever would have guessed what the cops said next. Not in a million years. Then, as almost everyone in the restaurant is looking at us, wait and kitchen staff included, one of the cops says, "Ryan Smith, I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of," enter girl's name here. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law," etc., etc., etc. And I think my jaw must have been touching the tablecloth as I felt my face burning with embarrassment. Like I said, almost everyone in the bistro was looking at Ryan as the cops walked him out in cuffs. Then suddenly, once he was in the back of the cop car, they all started looking at me. I can safely say without a shadow of doubt that this was the single worst moment of my life so far. It was a cocktail of absolute horror for me. Everyone's eyes on me, coupled with the embarrassment of having my date arrested while assuming everyone was thinking, what kind of girl goes out with a murder suspect? Is she dumb? Is she in on it? It was just awful. And then it hit me that if he really had killed some poor girl, was I his next intended victim? Did I just avoid being murdered by a matter of minutes, hours, days, or weeks? Was he looking at me with those big warm brown eyes while thinking, she's so smart and pretty? Or was he looking at me all hungry because he couldn't wait to hurt me? I barely remember walking out of the bistro, and the next day when I returned to pick my car up, I had to ask the maitre d' if I had walked out without paying. Turns out I hadn't actually paid, but the restaurant's owner overheard about the whole thing and told me that all the food and drink we'd consumed was on the house. It's a little acts of kindness like this which slowly restored my faith in humanity because, believe it, it had been badly shaken by the events of that Valentine's evening. I only really remember getting into the front seat of my car, calling my mom, then just ugly sobbing into the phone while she asked me, "Are you okay? What happened, honey?" Over and over again. Once I was finally able to get the words out, she told me not to drive home in such a state and to take a cab, and she was right. Even though I hadn't touched a drop of alcohol that evening, I was definitely in no fit state to drive. I suppose at that point I should just cut to the chase and tell you all what you want to know. And yes, Ryan was convicted of murdering the girl whose name I've chosen to omit. I was actually kind of hoping it was all just some horrible mistake, and that I hadn't seemed so dumb or naive to have gone on a date with an actual murderer. But nope. As the months went on, it progressed from an arrest to a trial to a full-on murder conviction. Ryan had gone on a date with some sweet, unsuspecting girl, taken her back to his apartment, then strangled her to death in the middle of being intimate. I remember my roommate saying that it might have been a kind of horrid accident, but it wasn't. Ryan had deliberately killed her, at a time when she literally couldn't have been more vulnerable. It might seem strange, but I did end up finding a kind of closure after the whole thing, and I recommend this variety of cognitive behavioral therapy to anyone who suffered a similar trauma. I wrote Ryan a letter, or more accurately, I wrote a letter to a prisoner number and addressed it to the correctional facility he was being held at. I couldn't even bear to write his name, nor could I bring myself to write mine either. He'd know who I was certain of it, and in the letter I told him in no uncertain terms that I hoped he would rot and burn forever. I told him a bunch of other things too, but those aren't fit enough to be reprinted anywhere remotely civilized. I don't know if he ever opened or read the letter, but the detective that I was in contact with informed me that it would most certainly be delivered. I hope he read my letter, and I hope it cut him up inside. I wanted him to feel as mortified and ashamed as I did in that bistro on that chilly Valentine's evening. I wanted him to read my words, and as he was reading, I wanted him to pray for the ground to just open up wide and swallow him whole, just as I did when all those people were looking at me with burning judgment in their eyes. I wanted so many things from that letter, but I only got one of them: closure. Some of you might be wondering why I haven't named anyone or anyone in this account. It's for a number of reasons, but the primary one, I know this for certain, is that the family of the girl my date had murdered requested the privacy and space to grieve following his trial. Unfortunately, this wasn't respected by elements of the local and national media, and the family ended up suing one of the more unscrupulous publications regarding an article they posted online. If you ask me, it was righteous litigation, and although I wouldn't be all that worried about them suing me, given how closely connected I am with the case, I'd like to respect their wishes for privacy and anonymity. On top of that, I'd like you to respect my privacy and anonymity, at least until my prospective killer is released. Because then, I'll go public, truly public, and no matter how much my prospective killer tries to carve out a new life, a new identity, or a new existence, I'm determined to make sure that everyone knows what a monster he really is.
So this just happened today. Against my better judgment, at the beginning of the month, I got a Tinder. I matched with a few guys, etc. One of them is James. We ended up texting each other and he seemed pretty chill and pretty into me. He's a decent looking guy and we seemed to click. He had apparently been in a relatively abusive relationship with a woman and he was looking to start over. According to him, she had hit him with a frying pan and pepper sprayed him once. He kept going on about how crazy she was. Alright, it happens. We went out to the movies this past Friday, and I had a great time. We ended up talking for a few hours and we hit it off pretty well. I asked about the ex because I was a bit curious as to why he'd stay with someone like that. He didn't say anything positive about her, just that she was crazy, had mental illnesses and didn't take her meds, that kind of stuff. She had tried to baby trap him, but she had a miscarriage. He expressed relief that she didn't end up with a kid. He said he had felt obligated to her. Again, I get that. In all, I had a good time. This morning rolls around and he tells me that he had hooked up with his ex last night, and that he was going to try and work things out with her. Mildly insulting that I lost out to an abusive chick, but whatever. I tell him it's cool. He then, a few hours later, texted me to say that she was crazy, and he thought she was changing, but she wasn't, blah blah. He kept asking if he could see me. He was being very pushy about wanting to see me today. He begged for 5 minutes of my time, so he could explain to me. I politely told him that I didn't want to be involved with someone who was so clearly hung up on his ex. This is where it got nuts. He admitted he still was, but that he wanted to see me today so I could meet her and she could determine if I was better for him than she was, and that she wanted him to be happy, because he and I had a connection. I flipped after that. Told him that the fact he needed his ex to determine who was right for him was absolutely nuts, and that is not what love is, and that I wanted no part of it. His ex started texting me after that, and it was non-stop insults and incoherent shit that made no sense. She also dropped the bomb that she was his wife. I told her to fuck off basically and blocked the number. I went on Tinder to message him, where I called him a piece of shit, and if he was intelligent, he should leave her and never message me again. He started to harass me, saying that I was miserable because they have a beautiful love together, and all this crazy shit. He then went on to say, "My wife knows where you work. I hope she doesn't do anything rash." And I told him if that was a threat, I would gladly go to the police. He then said that she's been to jail before, she's not afraid, and that she loves him so much she'd fuck anyone up and risk jail time for him. That she'd kill my friends if they tried to protect me. That she's armed and dangerous. I told him goodbye, reported him, and deleted my Tinder account. I did go to the police tonight, but since it wasn't a direct threat, they can't do much. The cops think that James was more or less full of shit and just trying to scare me, since some people love getting off on that shit. He said I did the right thing by blocking him and reporting him, and said I should just keep my eyes open and alert the people at my job. Scary thing is, James seemed perfectly normal, but he lied about being married, how he felt towards his wife, and he flipped like a switch. His excuse for not being upfront about being married was that they were going to get a divorce. He seemed so docile and unassuming, and the hatred and aggressive attitude was insane. I have to honestly wonder what would have happened had I gone to talk for 5 minutes. I'm kinda concerned since they do know where I work. But if either one of them try anything, then the cops can actually nail them. What a weekend.
Around March of 2014, I started talking to this girl on Tinder. She seemed cool and fun, and after about a week of talking, she suggested we meet in person. She invited me to this coffee shop, and I accepted. However, the day of, she started messaging me, saying she had to tell me something. Her pictures on Tinder weren't actually of her, and yes, she was a guy. He claimed he really liked talking to me though, and begged me to still meet up with him. Naturally, I declined. I blocked his profile and continued on my life. About a week later, I started talking to another girl. Once again, she seemed cool and fun and we hit it off. She asked me if I spoke to people on Tinder frequently, and, rather stupidly, I told her about my previous encounter with the man lady. Weeks later, I would realize that this new girl was the same girl as the week before. She asked me if I wanted to meet up, and I said sure, as long as it was in a public place. We decided on a cafe, and the next day, I sat at a table waiting. 5, 10, 15 minutes had passed, and she was nowhere to be found. I then peered out the window and saw, from across the street, a man staring at me intently. I looked away, waited a few seconds and looked back. He was still standing there staring. At that point, I left the cafe, got on my bike, I always bike everywhere, and booked it home. I was definitely a little freaked out, but tried to pull myself together, and reasoned that no one could have followed me. I then deleted my Tinder profile, and things were normal for a few weeks. About 3 weeks later, I started getting phone calls. The numbers all showed up as unknown. I picked up the first few times to some guy breathing heavily into the phone. I was already a little freaked out. I stopped picking up any call unless it displayed the caller's name. I then started receiving texts. At first, they were pretty harmless. Calls for attention and begging me to meet in person. It then changed to very sexual texts, until eventually, the messages became threatening, and whoever was messaging me started throwing out my family and friends' names and their whereabouts, saying that he or she would get them involved unless I answered. Because they were texting me, I could see a displayed number, but when I called phone providers, they told me the number couldn't be traced, and that it was probably a track phone. Great. I waited about 2 weeks, not responding to the texts, thinking that I shouldn't feed the troll. But eventually, it became too much. I started getting upwards of 50 texts and phone calls a day. I would wake up to 10 or 20 texts every morning. I then decided to change my number altogether. The texting and calls stopped for a while, but sure enough, it started happening again. I called my phone provider asking if they ever gave out numbers at a user's request, and they said that their policy stated that they wouldn't and couldn't unless valid identification was provided. Then, one day, I tried logging into my Facebook, but I was denied. Within a day, my friends started contacting me, asking what the hell I was doing, saying that they were getting terrible messages from my account. In particular, one of my girlfriends was receiving messages about her mom, who died years ago. I apologized profusely and told people what was going on. I contacted Facebook and explained the situation, and they helped me access my account again, at which point I deactivated it for a while. Enough was enough. I decided to contact the FBI, explaining what had been going on for over a month now. They documented everything, but since I or any of my relatives or friends were in no immediate danger, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything. At that point, I felt stuck. I thought about hiring a private investigator or a hacker. I decided against it, however, and just hoped it would fade out if I never answered. I left my Facebook deactivated and ignored any texts or phone calls. I never had any trouble at home, but Some of my closest friends received the occasional text as well, which weirded us all out. I hated that they got dragged into it. One day, I came home and things felt very eerie. The doors unlocked, windows open, and no one was there. I did a check of the place and found nothing else weird, so I locked everything up and just waited for my roommates to get home. It's been almost 7 months now. The calls and texts have more or less stopped. I'll get an occasional text, but at most, one every 2 weeks. At the peak of it, I was receiving almost 100 texts a day. It definitely affected my social and personal life. I became much more wary of the people around me and my surroundings. I just felt like I couldn't really focus on anything until it stopped. Work was difficult, though I tried to maintain my composure as best I could. Everything was just weird. Life was weird. I've since stopped using all forms of dating apps and websites. Things are getting back to normal at this point. I just want to put it all behind me. I'm moving at the end of this year, so it'll be nice to have a fresh start in a new place. I'm not going to sit here and say all dating apps are dangerous and no one should use them, but definitely cover your bases. Ask more questions before meeting someone. FaceTime them first, Skype, anything. I was naive about it, and I regret it. Be safe, stick close to your friends, and try meeting people in more traditional ways. Weird Tinder stalker? Let's not meet.